My wife came home from girls' night with her friends without a wedding ring. Just like that. As if nothing was wrong. As if the promise ring, the one I placed on her finger trembling with emotion years ago, was just a dispensable, forgettable accessory. She came in smiling, with a strange shine in her eyes and a perfume that wasn't the usual one. She walked to the bedroom, threw her bag on the armchair and gave me an empty, mechanical kiss, the kind you give out of obligation, not out of desire. When I asked about the ring, she put her hand on her finger and pretended to be surprised. "Ah, he must have slipped in the bar's bathroom. I didn't see when he fell," he said, turning to the mirror to let his hair down. But her eyes couldn't help the slight twitch. And there, at that exact moment, the world we built together began to crumble, brick by brick, silently. That night I didn't sleep. I watched the ceiling, repeating her every gesture, every word, every silence. I searched my friends' social networks, looked for photos, clues, anything that confirmed what I already knew. And the truth didn't take long to show its claws. None of the friends posted anything from that night. None were present at that bar, no selfies, no background music. It was as if that girls' night had never happened. And, perhaps, it really didn't happen. Or at least, not with girls. I invited everyone to a family lunch. He said he had important news, that he wanted to share a big decision. I made a point of bringing together parents, brothers, nephews, everyone. I prepared an atmosphere of celebration, of good news, of hope. I put my best smile on my face, even though inside I was crumbling. She, of course, accepted the invitation with the same lightness with which she lied about the ring, without imagining that I was about to change our lives forever. On that sunny Sunday, as the cutlery clinked on the plates and laughter filled the room, I asked for silence. I stood up, looked at everyone there and said, with a firm voice, "Today I'm not here to give good news. I'm here to announce the end of my marriage. And I'm here to tell you why." The silence was immediate. One of the uncle's knife stopped in midair. Her eyes widened. I discovered that I was betrayed. And the betrayal came not only from her body, but from the trust one had. And, as if that wasn't enough, she blatantly lied to my face. She thought she would never know, but I found out. She was in shock. He tried to speak, but his voice didn't come out. That's when I concluded, and what's more, the person she cheated on me with isn't just a stranger. It's someone who was with us a long time ago. Someone, who I also knew intimately. Her face fell apart. There was no air. The family froze. Nobody knew how to react. And her? He tried to maintain his posture, tried to control his breathing, but his eyes were already watering. She knew exactly who I was talking about. She knew that moment would come. I just didn't imagine it would be so public. So exposed. So brutal. In the days that followed, everyone asked me how I found out. But the most important thing was not the moment I confirmed the betrayal. It was what came before, the doubts that I ignored, the signs that I chose not to see, the silences that I accepted out of love. I was complicit in my own blindness. I trusted when I should have been paying attention. I let my guard down because I believed that love alone was enough. But it's not enough. It's never enough. Love without loyalty is just a house of cards built on sand. I tried. God knows I tried. I planned trips, bought gifts, created memories. I gave my all to make her feel loved, safe, wanted. But, in the end, all of this only served to make her more comfortable when it came to lying. Because those who cheat don't just cheat in their body. It betrays in the absence, in the disdain, in the look that no longer shines, in the touch that grows cold, in the rush to hang up the phone, in the lame excuses. She cheats when she exchanges her ring for red lipstick, when she lies with the same mouth that swears eternal love. And the cruelest thing, was the fate she chose to lose herself. I discovered that the night she said she spent with her friends, she spent with someone else. Someone who knew our history. Someone who knew our ups and downs, our routines, our most intimate moments. Someone who pretended to be my support while slowly stealing everything I loved most. It wasn't just betrayal. It was conspiracy. It was cold. It was a lack of character. But destiny, destiny is a cruel and brilliant author. Because what she didn't know was that, while she was plotting behind my back, the person nearby was someone who, discreetly, already saw my pain. Someone who knew my sadness, my silences, my sleepless nights. Someone who watched everything silently, but with his heart on fire. And it was this person, precisely this person, who she believed to be her best friend, who showed me what I needed to see. Who revealed to me what really happened that night. Who, in the end, saved me. And this, perhaps, is the greatest irony of all. While she was cheating on me, thinking she would never be discovered, the very friend who covered up her lie, fell in love with me. And he didn't just tell me the truth. She offered me something I hadn't felt in a long time, honesty. And now, everything has changed. The castle collapsed. But from the rubble, something unexpected began to emerge. And the question that never leaves the mind of anyone who heard this story is, how did all this happen? How was the betrayal engineered? How did I discover that her best friend was, at the same time, the key to the lie, and my rebirth? Are you ready to find out who she was, and what happened in the end? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. On the contrary, every story you hear is a fiction created to show how infidelity can destroy homes, hearts and futures. The narratives are fictional, but the feelings we portray are real, painful and deeply human. Get ready. What comes now is a shocking story, intense and unforgettable. Good story. They were always the couple who effortlessly attracted attention, not because of ostentation, but because of the subtle harmony they exuded when they were together. Daniel was a man of firm gestures and measured words, one of those who said little but carried a lot in his eyes. He worked as a strategic consultant in a multinational, a role that required concentration and analytical intelligence, something he performed naturally. He was reserved with his emotions, but with Laura he had learned to open up some gaps. She, on the other hand, was the opposite, spontaneous, with an easy laugh and a magnetism that made everyone around her feel welcome. Graduated in interior design, Laura found beauty in details that almost no one noticed. He could transform any cold space into a place with soul, just as he had done with Daniel's life. Their relationship began on a spring evening, in a cafe where they both happened to be. An exchange of glances, a comment about the music that was playing and the conversation simply flowed. The connection was immediate, almost as if they had found each other again after a long time apart. In the first months, everything was intensity, dedication, desire. And even though the two had different backgrounds, it was this difference that fueled the relationship. Daniel liked the way Laura saw poetry in chaos, while she admired the solidity with which he faced the world's problems. In just over 2 years, they decided to live together, and the wedding took place soon after, in a small ceremony, surrounded only by really important people. Over time, they built a routine that, although simple, worked. Laura worked from home, which allowed her more flexibility and also more time to take care of the apartment that she decorated with a mix of rusticity and elegance. Daniel left early every day and returned late in the afternoon, usually tired, but always willing to hear about her day, even if his eyes were heavy with sleep. They had their own rituals: coffee together on Sundays, movies on Fridays, silent walks in the park on Saturday mornings. They were not extravagant in statements, but they were careful. A blanket spread out on the sofa before she goes to bed, a note on the bathroom mirror wishing her good luck when presenting a project, a message in the middle of the day just to say, "I miss you." It wasn't a soap opera love, but it was real. The relationship, however, was not perfect. They had their crises, especially after Daniel received a promotion that left him increasingly immersed in his work. Lunches became meetings, dinners became emails and reports. Laura missed the man who made her laugh at sarcastic comments and who knew exactly when she needed a silent hug. On the other hand, Daniel also struggled with the pressure of his new role and felt that he could no longer be enough for everything and everyone. External demands began to generate internal distance. Nothing glaring, just that invisible space that grows between two people when eyes don't meet so often anymore. Still, they insisted. Because they loved each other. Because they believed it was just a phase. Because no relationship survives without effort. Laura has always had a very solid circle of friends. There was one friend in particular, Helena, who had been part of his life since his college days. The two had an almost brotherly bond, the kind that can be understood with a glance, that ends sentences and shares secrets. Helena visited the couple's house frequently, sometimes for impromptu dinners, sometimes just to share wine and confide. Daniel was always cordial with her, respectful, and even though they never had deep intimacy, he recognized the value of that friendship for Laura. Over time, however, he began to notice that Helena's presence became more and more constant, like an extension of the house itself. Sometimes he was there even when Laura didn't warn him, preparing a coffee or rearranging books on the shelf as if it were his own space. Despite this, Daniel never bothered. In fact, he began to see in Helena a certain support for his wife at times when he himself was emotionally absent. It was comforting to know that Laura didn't feel alone. And perhaps that's why he began to let his guard down with her, allowing deeper conversations to emerge, brief exchanges of confidences. Nothing that crossed the line, but enough that he started to see her as more than just his wife's friend. Still, he kept his distance. I knew there was a fine line there, and I never wanted to cross it. Time passed and the routine seemed to follow a predictable course. But there's always a point where something starts to fall apart without you even realizing it. Small changes started to happen. Laura became more introspective on certain days, looking far away. Sometimes he would leave without saying where he was going, returning with his hair undone and a different perfume. Daniel, in turn, became more and more immersed in his work, immersing himself in spreadsheets and presentations so as not to think too much about what he was failing to feel. She started avoiding weekends at home, finding excuses to go out, to isolate herself. They didn't fight. They just moved away. As if there was a fog between the two that prevented touch, affection, reunion. But there were also moments of rescue. Some dinners where they looked at each other more than necessary, laughs that escaped during a silly movie, sudden touches in the kitchen when they bumped into each other. And it was in these moments that Daniel felt a spark of hope. I believed, strongly, that it was possible to rebuild what they were losing. Laura, on the other hand, became increasingly silent. As if something was stopping her from diving back into that relationship. As if she held a guilt within her that consumed her in silence. On social media, they continued to seem like the perfect couple. Photos from old trips, birthday statements, celebratory dinners. But behind the cameras, silence was more present than words. The averted look spoke more than 1,000 messages of affection. The lack of sparkle in Laura's eyes began to become more evident to Daniel, even though he insisted on convincing himself that it was just tiredness, stress, routine. At some point, he became suspicious. But he chose not to ask. Maybe out of fear of the answer. Maybe out of cowardice. And then came the invitation to girls' night. Something that happened quite frequently. Laura loved these escapades. She said she needed moments with her friends, to breathe new air, to remember who she was besides being a wife. Daniel, as always, smiled and told her to enjoy. He stayed at home, watching a documentary without paying attention, hoping she would arrive soon. But that night, something was different. She took longer than usual, and when she arrived, something about her had changed. The look, the tone of voice, the rhythm of breathing. She said she was tired and went straight to the shower. That's when Daniel noticed the absence of the ring. He questioned. She responded with practiced naturalness. And everything continued as if nothing had happened. But there was no going back. That night changed everything. And Daniel, for the first time, knew he could no longer hide. Something inside him was triggered. A survival instinct. A cry for truth. And, even though he didn't know exactly what he was about to discover, he decided it was time to listen to the silence. To understand gestures. To finally look at what you avoided for so long. And that's when he had the idea. The family reunion. A lunch as an excuse to get everyone together, to prepare the scene for the revelation. But until that moment, Daniel still didn't know that what awaited him was much bigger than he imagined. Because the betrayal wasn't just in his wife's body. He was also in the allegiance of someone he believed to be only a supporting presence. And what would come next, would change everything forever. That night of the missing ring continued to reverberate like an uncomfortable whisper in Daniel's mind. The way Laura looked away, the hurried way she got out of the shower and locked herself in the room, as if she wanted to escape any conversation, all of that slowly dug a hole in his stomach. Unlike other times, she didn't hug him before going to sleep. She lay on her back, turned to the opposite side and pretended to be too exhausted for any touch. Daniel didn't say anything, he just stood there, with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if he was looking for some answer written in the cracks of the painting. That night was the beginning of the spiral that, even without knowing it, he could no longer avoid. In the following days, Laura seemed inconstant. There were times when she seemed more affectionate than usual, other times she was introspective, deep in thought. He started going out more frequently, always with the same vague excuses, a meeting with a client, a happy hour between professional colleagues, a quick visit to his mother. But Daniel knew every nuance of his wife. He knew how to recognize the difference between routine and dissimulation. The hugs, when they existed, seemed rushed. The kisses, automatic. It was as if she was trying to keep up appearances for fear that the curtain would fall prematurely. He observed everything with the coldness of someone who didn't want to believe what he already intuited, but with the precision of a man who began to analyze every detail like an equation that needed to be resolved urgently. At work, Daniel's productivity plummeted. His mind was always outside the company, trying to piece together the fragments of information he was slowly gathering. He started paying attention to her schedule, the tone of her voice when she spoke on the phone, the messages she deleted too quickly. One night, while she was sleeping, he took her cell phone and tried to unlock it, but Laura had changed the password. That was the trigger. Never before had she hidden something like that. The trust, which until then had sustained the relationship, began to crumble. Daniel began to sleep poorly, to eat less, to distrust every small gesture, every word spoken with hesitation. Still, he remained silent. Not out of cowardice, but because I needed to be sure. And more than that, he needed to plan his reaction with the coolness of someone preparing a well-aimed blow. It was Helena who appeared at her most vulnerable moment. One night, upon returning from one of those outings that Laura invented, Daniel found her in the kitchen, organizing things for a dinner for 3. Laura hadn't arrived yet, and Helena, as usual, acted as if the house were hers too. They chatted for a few minutes about trivialities, until she subtly touched his arm and asked if everything was okay. Daniel hesitated, but something inside him, perhaps tiredness, perhaps pent-up anger, made him respond more sincerely than he intended. He said that things weren't going well, that Laura felt distant, cold, and that there was something wrong. Helena listened in silence, with a curious look that Daniel was unable to decipher immediately. That night, they all had dinner together, and Laura, when she arrived, seemed especially uncomfortable seeing them talking alone. This did not go unnoticed. In the following days, Helena started sending him messages frequently, always asking if he needed anything, if he wanted to talk. Daniel, although reluctant, responded naturally. I knew she was one of the few people close to Laura, and maybe she could help understand what was happening. In a moment of weakness, he unburdened himself once again. He said he believed he was being betrayed. That he didn't know how to deal with the silent pain of feeling deceived, with the shame of being made a fool of in his own home. Helena didn't respond immediately. But the next day, he appeared with a different look, as if he knew something he still couldn't say. It was then that he decided to act. He began discreetly monitoring his wife's schedule. He installed a small tracking application on her cell phone, hidden between the operating systems. An act that I would never have considered if I had been emotionally balanced, but distrust has the power to justify the unjustifiable. In the first week, the data didn't show anything much. Laura followed a seemingly ordinary routine. But one Thursday night, something changed. She said she was going out to meet a friend, but the app showed that her car was parked in a distant neighborhood, on a street with no known shops or bars. Daniel took a screenshot of the location and kept it for himself. He felt his stomach turn, but he remained at home, quiet, looking at his cell phone as if he were watching his own life being torn apart in real time. The next day, Laura acted as if nothing had happened. Daniel didn't confront her, but with every gesture she made, the pain increased. He felt like a stranger in his own house, an intruder in his story. He then decided to confirm with evidence what was already obvious to the heart. He asked for help from a longtime friend, a digital security specialist, and gained access to conversations deleted from Laura's cell phone. The messages were there. Short, direct, full of codes and intimate nicknames. There were no names, there were no faces, but there was passion, desire, complicity. Everything that was once his now belonged to someone else. And yet Daniel didn't say a word. He chose silence as a weapon. Wait for the right moment. Because betraying is a choice, but unmasking requires art. He scheduled a family lunch as an excuse to celebrate something he pretended to be professional. He called everyone with an excited tone, like someone about to announce a promotion or a planned trip. Laura smiled when she heard about the meeting. He said he thought it was beautiful that he still wanted moments like this, even with his life so busy. Daniel just nodded. The days leading up to that Sunday seemed eternal. I woke up early, pretended to be normal, smiled out of obligation. But inside, it burned. Every look, every touch, every word of hers hurt him. Still, he resisted. Because I wanted to see her fall. I wanted to see the expression on his face when everything came to light. Sunday arrived. The house was arranged with meticulous detail. Laura, apparently, wanted to please. She cooked with dedication, setting the table with the set of crockery they used on special occasions. Relatives arrived one by one, with gifts, laughter, and warm hugs. The atmosphere was light, familiar. The food was served, glasses raised. Daniel waited. Patient, impenetrable. He watched Laura with cold eyes, as if he were seeing her for the first time. And, at one point, he asked for silence. The deep voice cut through the hustle and bustle of the room like a blade. He said he needed to announce something important. Laura looked at him, smiling, without imagining what was to come. He took a deep breath. He said that this was not a celebration lunch, but a closing one. That it was not an achievement, but a mourning. And then, with the coldness of someone who has already cried everything he had to cry, he announced the divorce. In front of everyone. He said that trust had been broken, that love had been disrespected, and that there was no way to continue. Laura was silent. He tried to form a reaction, but his throat failed. Those present looked at each other, astonished. The embarrassment spread like smoke. And then he added, I know. I know what you've been doing. I know with whom. I know where and when. The cup in her hand shook. An aunt put her hand to her mouth. A cousin looked down. Daniel remained impassive. The silence was broken only by a deep sigh, and she finally responded. He said it wasn't what it seemed. That things were confusing. Who didn't plan anything? But Daniel didn't move. He just stared into her eyes, waiting for something more. But it didn't come. Just contained tears, uneven breathing, a despair too timid to be redemption. Lunch ended abruptly. Guests leaving in a hurry, whispers in the hallway, heavy looks. Laura tried to get closer, but he moved away. He said there was something even more serious. Something she didn't even imagine he knew. Something that turned betrayal into something even dirtier. More wicked. And that this would be revealed soon. She froze. The face lost color. I didn't know what he was talking about. And that doubt would consume her like poison. Because Daniel now had all the game pieces in hand. And on the next move, he would show the final card. Laura spent the 2 days following lunch as a prisoner in her own home. The environment, which had previously been a refuge, now seemed like a minefield, where every gesture could trigger an explosion. Daniel didn't expel her immediately, but her silence was an insurmountable wall. He didn't scream, he didn't break anything, he didn't demand explanations, he just watched, as if waiting for something to happen. Laura tried to maintain her routine, cleaning the house, preparing coffee, but everything was automatic. Fear was ingrained in every movement. That final sentence at lunch never left your head. There's something even more serious. Something you don't even know I know. Since then, she couldn't sleep. I tried to understand what he had discovered. I was fully aware of the betrayal, the shame, the public humiliation, but I didn't know what else could be worse. And that doubt gnawed at her. Early Tuesday evening, Helena showed up unannounced. He had a tense expression, elusive eyes and a bottle of wine in his hands. He said he was there to provide support, that he wanted to talk, understand what had happened. Laura, with a choked voice, asked if she knew what Daniel was talking about at the end of lunch. Helena hesitated, looked at the floor, bit her lip and shook her head. I think he just said that to destabilize you, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But Laura knew her friend like she knew her own reflection. And at that moment I knew, without needing anything else, that there was more behind those words. He didn't insist. He poured the wine, they sat on the porch and, for the first time in days, Laura cried. He cried without restraint. Helena hugged her, but there was a stiffness in her arms that betrayed deep discomfort. Daniel, from the kitchen window, watched everything in silence. The next morning he left early and did not return for lunch. When Laura called, he answered with a simple, I can't talk right now. At night, he arrived home in silence, hung his jacket on the back of his chair and left a brown envelope on the table. Laura took it with shaking hands and opened it. Inside, there was a sequence of photos, printed in high quality, captured by a security camera. In all of them, Laura appeared entering a building, hand in hand with someone. The angles changed, but the companion's face was never clearly visible. Still, she knew who it was. He felt his stomach turn. Daniel didn't say a word. He walked to the bookshelf, picked up a book, sat down in the armchair and began leafing through it. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. His hands squeezed the paper as if it could make the images disappear. He left the envelope on the table and went up to his room in silence. Daniel remained there, motionless, looking at the pages without actually reading them. The next morning he asked to talk. They sat in the living room. Laura was pale, haggard, her eyes sunken from so many sleepless nights. Daniel spoke in a low voice, without raising his tone, but with a firmness that cut through the air. He said he no longer needed explanations. Who already knew what there was to know. And now she needed to hear it. Laura nodded, not having the courage to argue. That was when he revealed, with the calm of someone in absolute control of the situation, that he had discovered something deeper than physical infidelity. He said that, during his discreet investigations, he found digital traces left by Helena herself. Archived conversations, messages exchanged with third parties, screenshots captured from an old private group that involved Laura, Helena and 2 other friends. And among those messages was the revelation, the initial plan was never just a casual betrayal. There was a combination between Laura and Helena to keep Daniel under emotional control. A psychological game fueled by years of mutual dissatisfaction and frustration. Laura tried to deny it, but Daniel got up, walked to the office drawer and came back with a tablet. He opened a folder with the files and began reading the messages out loud. In one of them, Helena said, "He's so predictable. If one day you want to leave for good, we already know exactly how to manipulate the narrative." In another, Laura responded, "But if he finds out, it will be hell. Better to keep the theater going for a while longer." The words sounded like blades. Laura put her hands over her mouth in shock. The face fell into despair. She murmured that she didn't remember those conversations, that perhaps they had been out of context, said in a moment of anger, of crisis. But Daniel didn't react. He just read, one after another, the evidence he had kept for weeks. When he finished, he looked into her eyes and said, "You didn't just destroy our relationship. You tried to drive me crazy. And you had help." It was at that moment that the doorbell rang. Laura, astonished, opened the door. It was Helena. And before she could say anything, Daniel looked at her and said, "Come in. I think it's time for you to listen too." Helena froze. His eyes searched Laura's, looking for some clue of what was coming, but Laura was motionless, paralyzed. The three of them sat in the room, like characters in a silent courtroom. Daniel didn't wait. He asked, directly, if there was anything Helena would like to confess. She hesitated, took a deep breath and replied with an almost calculated coldness, "If you're talking about the betrayal, you already know. The rest, I don't think it's any of your business." Daniel smiled with one corner of his mouth. "Ah, but it is. Because now I'm going to tell you what you hid even from your best friend." Laura slowly turned to Helena, confused. Daniel then revealed what he had discovered a few days ago. He said that, when he confronted the owner of the building where Laura and her lover met, he discovered that the man who accompanied her was not a stranger. It was someone Helena knew very well. Someone who had been her boyfriend for years. And more than that, he was someone Helena still kept in touch with, in secret. Daniel then explained that Helena never stopped loving that man. That he had introduced him to Laura at a casual party, and that since then, he had fueled a kind of silent obsession. When he realized that Laura had gotten involved with him, he didn't stop her. On the contrary, he discreetly encouraged them, with dubious messages and ambiguous phrases, always pretending to be neutral. And when Daniel began to suspect, it was Helena who approached him. She was the one who offered comfort, support, and even friendship. Laura, eyes wide, began to understand. Helena looked away, now visibly disconcerted. Daniel stood up and continued, "You, Helena, took revenge on her behind her back, pushed her friend into the arms of someone who was still yours, fueled her guilt, used me as a piece in a sick emotional game. Betrayal wasn't enough, you needed everyone to lose, including you." Helena tried to respond, but Laura interrupted her with a dry scream, "Is that why you never judged me? Because you wanted to see me fall? Because you knew I was going straight into the abyss and you chose to push me rather than hold me?" Helena tried to justify it, saying that she never planned anything, that what she felt was confusing, that she was hurt. But his words no longer had any force. Laura cried in silence, sunk in a pain that was now far greater than that of a destroyed marriage. It was the pain of being betrayed by someone she called her sister. Daniel watched everything with a hard face. He got up again, walked to the door and opened it. He said, without looking back, "Now that everything is clear, you can leave. This house is no longer a place for lies." Helena was the first to get up. He walked past him in silence, without looking at him. Laura hesitated, but went to her room, picked up a suitcase and left without saying a word. Daniel closed the door. For the first time in months, he took a deep breath. The truth had been revealed. But he knew the pain would take time to leave. What he didn't know was what would come next. The sound of the door slamming behind the two women was like the end of a cycle. Daniel remained standing for a few moments, with his hand still resting on the doorknob, feeling the heat of the wood dissipate as his thoughts began to reorganize. The room now seemed larger, quieter, colder. He walked to the kitchen with slow steps, opened the refrigerator without any real purpose, then closed it and leaned on the counter, staring at the floor as if he was looking for a path to follow in the lines of the tile. Their absence was not an immediate relief, but rather a void full of meanings, of questions that might never be fully answered. For the first time in a long time, Daniel was alone. Truly alone. And it was precisely in that solitude that the most difficult process of all would begin, rebuilding oneself. In the days that followed, he avoided contact with his family, blocked messages from acquaintances, and left social media. I needed silence. He needed to understand how he had let everything get to that point. No longer about Laura and Helena, but about you. How could he, a man always so careful, so observant, allow himself to be emotionally manipulated in such a profound way? He started walking in the mornings, long walks through the streets of the neighborhood, always in silence, just observing the trees, the sidewalks, the movements of his neighbors. I stopped in small cafes, read old newspapers left on the tables, looked around as if everything were new. It was as if he had gone back to square one in his own life. One gray afternoon, when he entered a small bookstore that he used to frequent before he got married, he found a familiar figure sitting next to the window, with a book on his lap and a calm expression on his face. Clara had been a college classmate, a distant friend he hadn't seen in over 10 years. They exchanged sporadic messages on birthdays, but had never seen each other in person again. She looked up, smiled with genuine surprise, and stood up to hug him. The hug was simple, sincere, without questions. The conversation came naturally, as if the time between them had just been a pause. Daniel felt a kind of unexpected peace in that interaction. Something light, which contrasted deeply with the intense months he had experienced. In the following days, the meetings with Clara were repeated. First a coffee, then a walk, eventually an impromptu dinner in a discreet restaurant. She spoke intelligently and listened attentively, without trying to fill the silences, without judging the long pauses between Daniel's words. When he finally told her what had happened, she didn't react with shock or pity. Just listened. And when he spoke, it was with a serenity that completely disarmed him. He said he had already been through something similar. That the people we love also hurt us. Not out of malice, necessarily, but out of weakness, out of selfishness, because they don't know how to deal with their own needs. And that the hardest thing, after a betrayal, was not to forgive the other. It was about stopping blaming yourself for having loved someone who hurt us. That same week, Daniel received a letter left under the door. It was Laura's. The lyrics, still firm, began with an apology, but without sentimental overtones. She said she knew there was no return. Who didn't expect forgiveness, much less rapprochement? But there was something I needed to say. She wrote about the years they spent together, about the love that once existed and which, according to her, was never a lie. He explained that the relationship with the man with whom she cheated on him had no solid foundation. It was just a reflection of her internal confusion, a crooked mirror of everything she had stopped feeling for herself. He said that for a while he thought Daniel was the problem. But now she understood that the dissatisfaction was hers, that the anger he felt was against her. He confessed that it was Helena who introduced the two, but that he never understood the game behind it until it was too late. She ended the letter saying that she would leave for another city, start over, and that she wished him the same, a fresh start. Daniel folded the letter, put it in a drawer and never read it again. That didn't change anything. But, somehow, he closed a door that still remained ajar inside him. In the days that came, he and Clara grew closer naturally, without rushing, without labels. She understood his silences, his pauses, his hesitations. He never pressed for promises or demonstrations. It was as if it offered him a space to exist without having to prove anything. One night, after a simple dinner on the balcony of her apartment, Clara asked him what he expected from now on. Daniel thought for a moment, then replied that he just wanted peace. Who for years had confused stability with peace, routine with love. And now, finally, I began to distinguish. Meanwhile, Helena disappeared. Mutual friends said she had distanced herself from everyone. Some messages circulated, speculations arose, but Daniel didn't want to know. Not out of indifference, but because that chapter needed to stay where it was, in the past. It was no longer about revenge, or answers. It was about preserving itself. To move forward. Clara, who understood this better than anyone, didn't bring up the subject. When I looked at Daniel, I saw not just a wounded man, but a man rebuilding. And that was what really mattered. Months later, while walking with Clara through a street market, Daniel noticed something he never imagined he would feel again: lightness. Not euphoric happiness or blind enthusiasm, but solid serenity, like someone who finds their own rhythm. I felt like, despite everything, I was still able to believe in true connections. Not perfect, not eternal, but real. And that, at that moment, was enough. At the end of that night, lying next to Clara, Daniel held her hand firmly. I didn't say anything, nor was it necessary. She just squeezed back, in time. And there, in the silence shared between two emotional survivors, something was sealed. A new beginning, not as an escape from the past, but as a consequence of the courage to face it. Because love, when it returns after chaos, does not come to fix what was broken. He comes to show that, even in pieces, we are still capable of feeling. In the days following the revelation, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Daniel continued his routine with almost surgical precision, as if he needed to keep the gears working so as not to fall apart altogether. The weight of the truth had already been faced, the mask removed, the bonds cut, but the echo of words, expressions, gestures frozen in time still accompanied him in every corner of the house. It was strange to see how objects that were once common were transformed into relics of a life that no longer existed: Laura's favorite book still on the bedside table, the paintings they had chosen together, the frame with a forgotten photo from some birthday. Those silent elements became traces of something that no longer belonged to him, and yet, they insisted on remembering that for many years all that was real. The nights were still the hardest. Even with Clara present in some of them, there were moments when silence filled the space between them with an almost physical density. She noticed, but never questioned it. He just offered his presence as an anchor, like someone who understands that emotional grief needs to be respected without urgency, without attempts to replace it. Daniel, in turn, began to see nuances of what he had experienced that had previously been hidden. No longer as a betrayed man, but as someone who had allowed small, silent, constant concessions to undermine his own identity within the relationship. It was a deeper kind of pain, because it didn't just come from what was done to him, but from what he stopped being. One day, he received an unexpected email from a name he hadn't seen in years: Marcos, a distant friend, Helena's foster brother. The words in the email were sobering, but there was an underlying urgency. It said she had completely withdrawn, cut off contact with her family, left her job and moved to a smaller town. That he had refused any help and that, according to close friends, he was living in isolation, avoiding confrontations, brooding over everything in silence. Daniel read the email 3 times, not knowing exactly how to react. He didn't feel compassion, but he couldn't feel indifferent either. After all, she was also a victim of herself, swallowed by her own choices. The moral dilemma arose almost violently: should he care? Did he have any role to play in the fate of the one who manipulated him with such coldness? He decided not to respond. The truth is that, at that moment, Daniel was still trying to understand his own limits. For a long time, he had prioritized the well-being of others over his own. Now, everything about him cried out for self-care. As much as a part of his essence wanted to reach out, there was a voice inside him that whispered that it wasn't his responsibility to fix what he didn't destroy. And that voice, little by little, began to grow, to take shape. He understood that forgiveness and redemption are different paths and that, sometimes, forgiving meant not going back. Laura, on the other hand, had disappeared from any radar. The only trace he had left was that letter, with no return, no address. Mutual friends said she was living with a distant cousin, trying to rebuild her life, looking for work. But none of that mattered anymore. Daniel didn't want revenge, nor did he want redemption for her. I just wanted the past to stay where it belonged, in the past. And although there was no longer active pain when thinking about her, there were still scars that burned on rainy days, memories that came uninvited when she smelled the scent of someone similar to hers, or when she heard certain music. He didn't hate her. Hatred demands energy that he was no longer willing to give. What I felt was a kind of resolved grief. The acceptance that love, however strong it may seem, cannot survive lies sustained for too long. Clara became part of his life with more presence, but without fuss. He knew how to occupy space with balance, he never demanded, he just offered. In moments of lightness, Daniel laughed again. Little by little, the smile began to appear again without guilt, the touch began to be born from a genuine desire and not from a need to forget. It was a new kind of love. Less passionate, perhaps, but more true. Founded on a silent complicity, on a mutual respect that was born precisely from the fact that both had already been broken. She also brought her pain, her reservations, her shadows. And it was perhaps this shared darkness that brought them together so solidly. Despite this, there were nights when Daniel wondered if it would be possible to trust like he used to again. Not Clara, specifically, but someone. The betrayal he had suffered was not just physical. It had been an emotional invasion, a complete distortion of the meaning of intimacy. Knowing that Helena, the ex-wife's closest friend, had played such a decisive role in destabilizing their relationship was the kind of wound that hurt in layers. It was the realization that not all enemies are outside. Some share dinners, listen to confidences, and use silence as a weapon. And it was this idea, more than any other, that prevented him from giving himself fully to any bond. The internal dilemma grew as time passed. Daniel knew he was rebuilding his life, but he couldn't ignore the fact that he had left parts of himself along the way. He was afraid of becoming cynical, of becoming too hardened, of stopping believing in the possibility of genuine love. Therefore, he forced himself not to avoid vulnerabilities. He allowed himself to talk to Clara about his insecurities, his hesitations. He talked about the feeling of always being on alert, as if something bad could happen at any moment. She listened, welcomed, but also challenged him. He said that confidence is not born from the absence of fear, but from the choice to continue even with it present. And perhaps that was what kept him there, the certainty that, even though he was injured, he was still capable of choosing. One day, during lunch with his sister, who he had avoided seeing since the family meeting, the subject finally came up. She asked if he was really well or just pretending to be functional. Daniel hesitated, took a sip of wine and responded with brutal honesty. He said he didn't know for sure. That there were days when I felt like everything was finally on track, and others when the emptiness was so great that any conversation became a burden. She looked at him with teary eyes and replied that, perhaps, the answer was right there, in the fact that he didn't pretend to be okay. That this was already a sign of healing. For the first time since it all began, Daniel felt a familial warmth that didn't smother him with advice but enveloped him with acceptance. That day, for the first time in months, he felt like he was truly on the right path. Clara suggested a short trip. A weekend away, in a new place, with no past, no memories. Daniel accepted. The destination was a small town by the sea, quiet, with small inns and cobblestone streets. 2 days passed between silent walks and deep conversations. On the last day, as they watched the sea at dusk, Clara asked him if he believed that all that had happened for a reason. Daniel was silent for a few minutes. Then he replied that he didn't know if everything needed to have a meaning, but that if pain was useful for something, it should at least teach. Teaching that love is not a pact of perfection, but a commitment to the truth. That no one betrays by chance, but also that no one deserves to live as a prisoner of other people's mistakes. When they returned from the trip, something was different. Not on the outside, but within it. It was as if, finally, the time had come to truly start over. There was no longer anger, nor desire for explanations. What existed was the certainty that the cycle had ended. And now, more than ever, he needed to look ahead. But destiny, always attentive to details, still had one last piece to move. One last revelation to be made. Because not every story ends where we think it should. Some still carry seeds planted unintentionally, which germinate at the right time, at the most unexpected time. And for Daniel, that moment was about to arrive. Daniel and Clara's return from their trip to the coastal city seemed, at first glance, to be the end of a cycle. The salty breeze and the sound of the waves still echoed like a recent memory in their bodies, as if the sea had washed away, at least temporarily, the most visible traces of pain. But there was something new hanging in the air. It wasn't tension, nor exactly lightness. It was the feeling that something was yet to be said, to be experienced. Clara noticed Daniel's calmer look, his softer gestures, his more frequent smiles. But she also knew that any reconstruction requires acceptance, and that this acceptance often involves understanding that not all questions will have answers. It was difficult not to wonder if the man with whom he shared coffee and silence still carried, even if well guarded, a desire to regain what was lost. Or, more painfully, if he was still hoping for some kind of come to terms with the past. And it was this doubt that she, despite not confessing, tried to camouflage with presence and affection. On a cloudy Saturday, Clara suggested a trip to a contemporary art exhibition that had been installed in an old renovated industrial warehouse. It was the type of program she enjoyed, and Daniel, even without great enthusiasm, accepted. There, amid silent installations and paintings that seemed to scream stories without words, they found one piece in particular that held them for minutes, a series of portraits about emotional reconstruction, black and white photographs that captured faces between tears and smiles, portraits of those who had clearly loved too much. Clara held Daniel's arm lightly and whispered something that, although simple, crossed him like a revelation. It's strange how pain shapes beauty, isn't it? He looked at her, for a long time, and responded with just a nod. At that moment, without her knowing, he understood that, even though the past still burned in some points of his memory, his heart was already heading in another direction. A cleaner, more lucid direction. The following Monday, when he returned from work, he found a letter under the door, without an envelope. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It wasn't Laura's. It was Helena's. And just seeing those letters again gave him a feeling that he couldn't immediately identify: anger, curiosity, contempt. He took the letter cautiously, closed the door behind him and stood in the corridor, observing the paper as if evaluating a trap. He sat down in the armchair, took a deep breath and began to read. Helena talked about regret. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but he explained. She said she never imagined how cruel her unresolved feelings could turn her. That he wasn't at peace and that maybe he never would be, but that he felt like he needed to write, if only to let him know that he didn't hate him, that he never hated him. She also said that she had been diagnosed with severe depression, that she was undergoing treatment and away from everything. That he spent his days in silence, reviewing everything he had done. The letter did not beg for compassion. It was a last act from someone who seemed to have already given up on going back to who he was. Daniel folded the letter carefully, kept it in a box along with other traces of the story he lived and never spoke about it again. Telling Clara about the letter would be like sharing a weight that was no longer hers. And, in a way, he felt like he wasn't his anymore either. He didn't respond. He didn't look for Helena. That, for him, was just another period where before there was a painful comma. I needed to finish burying this chapter without reliving it. Clara noticed his growing introspection, and even without knowing what caused that new silence, she respected it. There were days when Daniel seemed to be somewhere else. Not distant, but immersed in layers of thought that he did not share. Until, one cold night, while they were watching a film that they both weren't paying attention to, she asked, "Do you already see me as present, or are you still trying to understand the past?" Daniel turned to her with a calm but firm look and replied with disarming sincerity, "You are the now. What was left behind still echoes, but it no longer defines me. And if I'm slow to surrender, it's not because of a lack of desire, it's because of an excess of respect." Clara nodded. It was the first time he heard something that, even without saying, "I love you," carried all the weight and beauty of those words. The weeks passed and Daniel, little by little, began to make room in his life for the new. He resumed personal projects, started visiting his parents more frequently, and reconnected with ties he had left adrift. In one of these meetings, during a casual dinner with his sister and brother-in-law, he received news that, although apparently small, would change the course of things once again. The sister, excited, commented that she had seen Laura at a design fair in the neighboring city, exhibiting original pieces and being very well received. He said she looked thinner, more introspective, but that her work was gaining notoriety. Daniel listened in silence, smiled in a formal manner and diverted the subject. But inside, something was changing. It wasn't jealousy, nor longing. It was just the realization that, even though they were separated, their paths still crossed at unforeseen intersections. That same week, while walking through a park far from home, where he used to go during the first months of mourning, he saw a figure sitting on the concrete bench, facing the lake. There was no doubt. It was Laura. She was alone, with her eyes fixed on the water, holding a notebook in her lap. Daniel stopped, hesitated, and briefly considered simply turning around. But he didn't. He approached slowly, as if he didn't want to scare her, and said his name in a low voice. She looked up with genuine surprise, followed by a sad but sincere smile. The silence between the two lasted less than they expected. Daniel sat next to her, and for a moment, they said nothing. They just watched the ducks swimming lazily on the lake shore. Laura was the first to speak. She said she didn't expect to see him, that sometimes she wondered if he still hated her. Daniel responded that hate requires an emotional intensity that he no longer had for her. She smiled, lowered her head and commented that she had tried to rebuild her own life, but that it was not easy to deal with what she had caused. He confessed that he still felt ashamed when he looked in the mirror. Daniel, with his eyes fixed on the lake, said that what she had done caused an irreparable rupture, but that the real punishment might be precisely to continue, day after day, aware of it. And that she, at least, was trying to do something good with it. Laura then touched on something that Daniel didn't expect. He asked if he was happy. Not as a provocation, but as a genuine question. Daniel took a deep breath before responding. He said he didn't know if happiness was the right term, but that he felt peace. And that, at that moment in life, was more than enough. She nodded with teary eyes, as if she knew this would be the last conversation between them. And it was. There was no hug, no goodbye with promises. Just a wave and two bodies walking in opposite directions, finally free of each other. Daniel returned home feeling something different. It was as if the last pending cycle had finally closed. When he told Clara, she listened attentively, and at the end she just asked, "And what did you feel when you saw her?" Daniel replied with a light smile, "Gratitude. Because if it weren't for all that, maybe I would never have learned to really see myself." Clara hugged him without saying anything. And it was in that shared silence, once again, that Daniel understood that sometimes, life needs to be completely shattered so that something truly new can be born. But he still didn't know that destiny had one more page in store. One last bend in the path. And it would be this curve that would, in fact, define how everything would end. Spring arrived discreetly that year, without rushing, spreading its perfume among the dry branches that began to bloom again as if they didn't know that one day they had withered. Daniel walked among the trees in the park he now visited frequently, feeling that his own life was following the same rhythm, being reborn little by little, without fanfare, but firmly. He no longer needed to prove to himself that he was cured, because he understood that true healing did not come from the absence of pain, but from the ability to live with it without allowing the past to interfere with the ability to surrender to the present. Clara was by his side in this process, but not as a crutch, but as company. The relationship between them had grown at the right time, fueled by sincere conversations, by respected silences, by mutual admiration. Daniel was now observing her with eyes that no longer sought comparison with what he had experienced before, but that saw in her a whole woman, with scars of her own, who she chose to follow even when she had every reason to retreat. And that was enough. A week after that last meeting with Laura, Daniel received an unexpected call. It was from the police. Helena's name came with a weight that he had already forgotten to carry. They said she had been hospitalized after a suicide attempt. She was alive, but fragile, with no one close enough to accompany her. Marcos, his foster brother, was out of the country and the hospital needed someone responsible for immediate decisions. Daniel hesitated. He spent hours walking around the room, between confused thoughts, pondering how much he was still responsible for someone who had caused him so much. In the end, he decided to go there. Not for her. For him. To end everything in the most dignified way possible. Arriving at the hospital, he saw her for the first time in months, thin, pale, with her gaze lost at some point on the wall. When he entered, she looked away, embarrassed. Daniel didn't say anything right away. He just sat to the side, waiting. Until she, with an almost imperceptible voice, said that she didn't expect to see him there. He replied that, although there was no longer anger, there was still a trace of humanity that did not allow him to leave someone alone in a situation like that. The dialogue that followed was brief but definitive. Helena said that she had lost herself when she tried to control other people's feelings. That his obsession with Daniel and Laura had been an unconscious way of trying to prove that he could still be important. That when destroying, she felt alive. But now, all that was left was the weight of regret. Daniel listened to her without interrupting. And in the end, he just said that he hoped she found some kind of redemption, even if far from him, even if alone. He asked me not to look for him anymore. He stood up, shook her hand firmly and left. And when he walked through the door of that room, he felt lighter than at any time in years. It was the end of the last chain that tied him to the past. Clara, upon learning what had happened, hugged him for long minutes, in silence. That night, Daniel did not sleep in the armchair, nor in the guest room. For the first time, he lay down next to her with a peaceful, surrendered heart. In the middle of the night, she woke up when she felt his hand stroking her hair and, with her eyes still half closed, asked if he was okay. Daniel smiled and said yes, that for the first time in a long time he felt like the weight was no longer on his shoulders. That now I could finally live without carrying memories like armor. And she, with a kiss on his shoulder, replied that now was all they had and all they needed. From that night on, they started to share not just moments, but plans. Small plans. A new closet, a living room renovation, a trip to see the place where Clara grew up. And little by little, each divided choice turned into a new foundation, solid, honest. Meanwhile, Laura continued her distant path. Her work as a designer was finally gaining recognition and she found, between sketches and projects, a type of silence that healed her. He didn't look for Daniel anymore, he didn't write new letters, he didn't show up by surprise. He respected his space and, perhaps for the first time, he respected his own reconstruction time. Over time, he heard from acquaintances that he had started again, that he was at peace. And despite the lump it caused in his throat, he learned to accept that certain losses are definitive. That loving someone is not a guarantee of permanence, and that betraying a true love is often signing its end sentence. But she also understood that love, even when it fails, leaves seeds. And that, if well cared for, regret can transform into maturity. Laura no longer sought redemption. I just tried not to repeat my mistakes. And that, for her, was enough. Months later, Daniel and Clara participated in a charity event organized by friends of her family. During the night, surrounded by new people, music and genuine laughter, Daniel realized that he no longer thought of the past as a battlefield. The memories no longer caused his chest to spasm. There was no more weight in naming names, no more shame in looking back. There was only one route. A path lived with all the pain and all the choices that led him there. Clara, by his side, danced like someone carrying the world on their feet without ever stopping to smile. And in that instant, he knew he had found more than a new love. He would find peace. A peace built with scars, with difficult truths, but also with courage. When, at the end of the event, they returned home, Clara looked at him as he took off her earrings and asked, almost jokingly, what he would say to Daniel from 2 years ago if he could talk to him now. He thought for a few seconds, then replied with his eyes fixed on hers, would say that it will hurt a lot, more than he thinks he can bear. But that he will survive. And that, in the end, he will be grateful for all of this. Because only those who survive the fall learn to fly again with more lightness. She smiled, touched his face and said, then we'll fly together. And they flew. Not over the past, but from it. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments what you thought of this story. What would you do if you were in Daniel's shoes? Could you forgive? Do you think he made the right choice by moving forward and not looking back? I really want to know your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Every week we have new intense, real, exciting narratives. And remember, here, on this channel, we do not support any type of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but the feelings we explore are deep and true. They serve as a reflection of the consequences that wrong choices can cause. Until next time.